Shall we start?
You got to do all the heavy lifting here.
Well, I want to say, I'm going to ask you the question people always ask writers. I know that you have moved to the Smoky Mountains, and you more or less live in a forest. So when I was reading the overstory, I had to ask, are any of these trees real people?
That was a great start. Well, what do we say when they say it about characters? Well,
It's a composite.
These trees are hybrids, let's call it that, right? It's funny, I mean, I do, you know, mine is, for instance, is a kind of recreation of my Methuselah tree up on Skyline that I talked about in the intro. And then there are others, you know, the chestnut tree that's planted way out of the native range in Iowa and grows up with this native family. That's based on an experience, you know, on a cultivated tree way out of its range that actually survives the chestnut blight because it's so far out. You know, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, when you know when I was first starting out on mine, you were first starting out on American Marriage about the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And then they came out about the same time. So early on, you know, it was like, how do I make them into characters? You know, and how do I give them that same degree of palpability that the humans are going to have?
So when you did that, I mean, you do anthropomorphize the trees.
Yeah, and I don't apologize for that in a way, because in some ways that prohibition against anthropomorphizing natural things that science uses to kind of keep itself objective and independent, it's almost gone too far. There are ways in which that prohibition against anthropomorphizing has made it very difficult for us to see that we are continuous genetically with the rest. I mean, it's just I mean, think of this. When I was in school, I remember sitting in psychology class and the professor saying, no, you know, chimpanzees and great apes, they're not conscious. And that was a status. That wasn't this one outlier guy. I mean, that was kind of consensual wisdom at the time. That prohibition against anthropomorphizing, saying, look, they look like they're having emotions. They look like they're, you know, planning things. Why is that so hard for us to get? There's something about this human exceptionalism thing that's made it really, really tough for us to say, there's a story there that's right next to our story.
I mean, it's true. I mean, this is random, but the vet told me that my cat is not jealous. And my cat is jealous.
You know your cat
yes.
is jealous. I mean, look, you know.
And my cat plots revenge. But when I read the overstory, I was thinking that perhaps, you know, that perhaps I do feel my cat, her name is Canella. Maybe I feel like Canella is exceptional, but it made me think that, you know, you're doing kind of the same thing with vegetation, with wildlife.
Yeah, and interestingly, that same scientific prohibition against seeing complex agency or volitional behavior or surprise collaborative or social behavior on the part of plants made these discoveries that have been unfurling over the last 30 or 40 years so belated. I mean, there was nothing that a botanist in 1850 couldn't have, you know, well, I guess there were some things. But in the last 40 years, for these people to come out and say, as one of my characters does and is persecuted for it, that, for instance, an acacia tree that's being nibbled on by an herbivore in West Africa, you know, we know that it starts, you know, after a while, it starts to put out chemicals to make itself unpalatable to that herbivore, and the herbivore has to push on. But now, when the researcher says it's also putting out distress signals over the air, and the nearby acacias are getting that signal and starting to preemptively produce those same chemicals to make them unpalatable. Wow, you mean they're sharing an immune system? Only to those who are willing to, you know, to anthropomorphize just a little bit in order to see what's happening out there.
And well, don't you think this also allows you to use the novel as a form to talk about this because, you know, people like to read novels about people or, and in this case, a novel about trees that seem kind of, is there a word, people-y? People-y?
Right.
But,
there is now.
I mean, but why do you think, I mean, this is your 12th novel, and this novel has enjoyed a lot of what I guess I'll call, you know, mainstream readership. What do you think about this moment has caused this book, of all your books that I think that, you know, like when I said it's a book about trees, it makes people chuckle, yet this is your most popular work. To what do you attribute this?
I think you just have to live to 60 to have your breakout. Well, actually, you beat this by a couple decades, but no. So let me go back to this original question. So the first part of the question, and remind me?
Why this book? Why here? Why now?
Yeah, no, I mean, there was something before that.
Books, people like books about people?
Yeah, it had to
These
do
are
with the literary bias toward things that look like us.
I'm going to say not even literary. I think just the
Yeah.
day-to-day bias.
Yeah.
I mean, like when people describe someone as a tree hugger, for example, it's a joke, it's a sense.
Yeah.
People feel that it's something that is detached from what we think is important.
They've somehow ridiculously extended their powers of empathy into a place where it shouldn't exist.
Right, like when people say that people are into trees, yeah, it makes it sound like they're not into people or they're not, that they don't have other things to think about. It seems like they're making something urgent that isn't urgent. Is that because trees are so slow to grow? Like, what is that?
There's a moment in this book where the woman who grows up to be this kind of transgressive botanist, dendrologist, is being schooled by her father. You know, she's a little girl. She had a kind of belatedly diagnosed hearing deficit, and as a result, her speech was also difficult to understand, and she's ostracized by her classmates and so forth. And she finds in the plant world a kind of affinity that she can't find in the human world. It helps that her father's also an extension agent and takes her on his trips with her and starts to teach her all these things. And she says, you know, at school, Dad, you know, it's like my classmates can't tell the difference between a shagbark and a pignut hickory. What's up with that?
It happens.
Well, so, and he says, you know, it's funny, but we only perk up when the thing looks like us. And that has a lot to do with long adaptation, right? The reason we have big brains is we're social creatures and we need to keep track of each other and we need to know who owes us favors and who we owe favors to, who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. The things that attract us move at about the speed that we do. They're about the size that we are. Other adaptations, you know, we learn to look out for predators and so forth and what's good to eat. But this thing that unfolds on mind-boggling time frames on a scale that we just can't put together. It's amazing that anybody gets empathy enough to take them seriously.
But, you know, I think about this moment we're in where the climate is under siege, the earth is under siege, and it makes a story like this seem more urgent, but also we're in a particular political moment where a lot of people are under siege, you know, at the same time.
You want to use the T word, don't you?
Which
Go ahead. Well, no, and that's,
But you know what I mean? Like, I do feel like we're in this political climate where, you know, the EPA is done, right? Like, it's open season on the environment. And it does seem like a book like yours is more urgent than ever. But then there's also this sense that with all the other things we're seeing politically, that sometimes when I've talked to people about the premise of this book before they've read it, but just hearing about it, they feel like we are not in a tree moment right now.
Yeah, I'm not into trees. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is an interesting thing. So back in the day, when I did used to teach, my poor undergraduates had to hear this taxonomy about conflict. So, and you know, we've talked about related things too. The kite flies against the wind, doesn't fly with the wind. You have to stack the deck against what your characters want, right? There has to be some kind of conflict. So where can that conflict come from? And it's a very simple taxonomy, but I think it includes most possibilities. Whenever we have an internal value, it immediately sets up inverse value that's going to cause problems for that person. So if I say, I love you dearly and I'm going to be loyal to you for the rest of my life, and the novelist starts to say, okay, what's the problem going to be? And the problem is that someday Rick is going to have to choose between honesty and loyalty.
Really?
We can talk about this later, but so there's, think of how many books are set up on this thing, where it's like, do I tell them now and risk the friendship, or do I look the other way, and then they're going to find out later and say, why the hell didn't you tell me? So that's interior conflict is our bread and butter, right? I mean, that's 8/10 of literary fiction. Now, the next level is I have completely defensible and honorable and sympathetic values, and the readers are looking, are seeing me go to town, and they say, there's a good guy, and he's doing the best he can, more or less, and you are doing the same, right? And but whatever my set of values is, and you can set it up. You have there's an incredible moment in American marriage. And in the full context, maybe we don't need the whole thing, but Celeste and Roy, trying to work this out, Celestial and Roy. And she's saying, I'm out here and you have no idea how and he's saying, I'm in here, and she's saying, there's what do you want me to do? And he says, I'm innocent.
And she says, I'm innocent too.
I'm innocent too. That is a chilling moment. And it's the perfect exemplum of this kind of dialogical, morally distributed, novel where, your readers probably come up to you sometimes and say, well, who's right? Mm-hmm. And you're saying that problem is left up to the reader as an exercise, right? I mean, the reality is both of those positions are deeply sympathetic and true. So that's, the thing that powers that book is that it now graduates from a private psychological drama to a political drama. She's in there because his country's messed up. And she has to pay the price for him. Who's asking her to do? Why should she? So that's the perfect example of incommensurable values between decent people, right? So you have a person against his or herself, and you have a good person against another person. There is a third level of drama, and it used to be all over literature. In fact, most world literature, for most of the history of literature, knew about this third level of drama, which is that the living world sees things differently than Homo sapiens sees. That there are conditions for living here that aren't palatable to us. And we're struggling to figure out how to stay here. And I think what happened to literary fiction is, around about 3/4 of the way through the 19th century, that battle was over. Or so we thought, that somehow the battle between people and the beyond people, or the non-people, that it was over, and there was only one species standing, and we were in charge, and everybody else was there, as the Bible says, to have dominion over, and so that third kind of conflict, psychological, political, or socio-political, now environmental, that disappears and becomes kind of archaic. You could do it as a kind of fake Jack London-y thing, in a nostalgic way. But see, now your question about what's happening now, we now know that we did not win that battle. And not only didn't we win it, but we're losing it spectacularly. But now that's got to come back into our stories.
Yeah, but there's a sense of urgency. I think we all understand that if there is no Earth, if the planet is not hospitable to life,
then all these other questions are just luxuries.
Yes,
right?
and all the other
They
questions
disappear.
are luxuries. But there is a sense that the question of environment why does it feel so luxurious, I guess? Because I understand that, you see what I mean? Like it's a thing that emotionally registers the opposite of what the reality is.
Because I think we are still, by and large, colonized by this idea that in fact we can manage the planet. And these other things are just kind of inconveniences.
And maybe there's a sense that the consequence is so far off that we'll just kick it down the road a few generations, but I feel like that problem is now.
Well, that's increasingly. But that goes back to this sense of how difficult it is for humans who have this legacy hardware that isn't really great at picking out slow background changes. So, oh wait, there's something moving over here. Something's on Facebook, or whatever, right?
You're not even on Facebook.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. I mean, the reality is, even if we were especially adept at being luxurious in our interpersonal relationships, it would still be hard for us to take seriously things that can only be seen through mathematical modeling that are unfolding over long periods of time.
Yet you managed to create urgency with this novel. Now I'm going to ask you, speaking of things that unfold slowly, you said this novel took you 5.5 years to write. Can you tell us a little bit about the process by which you write a novel? Like, I know at one point you were using voice recognition software.
Yeah.
Do you still do it? You still into that?
I didn't for this book.
Why not?
Because there were 9 different people, and because there were so many narrative modes. As you move through this book from the root section to the trunk section to the branches section, the mix of dramatization to narration, the mix of close focalization to more distant focalization, changing all the time. And I couldn't hear it out loud.
So how did you do it? Did you write it? Did you?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's just trading one kind of technological luxury for another, but I actually did a fair amount of it longhand onto a touchscreen and had it converted into text. And there's something about that tactile, that's a very 19th century thing. Well, you aren't, I mean, you're not state of the art either, right?
I use typewriters.
Which, I mean, to me, a typewriter is harder than longhand. I mean, because, once I do the longhand, I've got my revisable draft right there.
Yeah, but the typewriter makes so much noise. You feel like you're getting something done. It's so satisfying.
That's true. That's true. And a little ding every time you get to the end of the line.
Yes, at the end of every line, a little reward, ding, and you dramatically slap it back. I love it. I'm all about the typewriter. I should get you one. You want one? I should get him one for his birthday,
I want your
shouldn't I?
stationery. That's what I want.
Now, here's something. So you wrote this novel over 5 years. When you submitted it, did you have any idea the impact the book was going to have?
I knew something, and it's hard to answer the question because it sounds fulsome, or foolish. But that topic exalted me. I just loved living there. And it was so, it changed me so profoundly. I mean, you mentioned where I live now. I mean, 2 years into the research of the book, I kept, this stunning figure that there's almost no old growth left. That to see what a forest looked like, you have to travel to fairly obscure places, that only 2% of the uncut forest still existed. And I kept reading that if you want to see what an eastern broadleaf deciduous old growth looked like, you had to go to the Smokies, because it's one of the largest contiguous extant original forests left. And 4 years ago, I just went on a research mission, and I just said, I'm going to go have a look. And walking up the side of those mountains in southern Appalachia, from the regrowth forest into the old growth forest. I mean, I didn't even know a quarter of what I knew now, but you don't have to. When you pass from what's grown back in a century to what was there as it was 10,000 years ago, everything changes. It looks different, it sounds different, it smells different. The species count goes way up. The quality of the light, the variability of the sizes of the trees, seeing these tulip poplars that were 27 feet in circumference, I just couldn't get enough of it. you know, and for the first time I thought, you know what? We're not a happy people.
What do you mean?
I left there and worked this out over the period of 8 or 9 or 10 months. The reason that we're writing all these stories about how hard it is to find happiness and meaning is because we've been told through our arts and through our society and through our economy that meaning is a privately made, subjective, individual, human exceptionalist, commodity-mediated thing. How rewarding can that be? How many stories can you tell to make that seem palatable? And I'm thinking, you know, we used to know something else. We used to know that meaning was out there, and that you can't tell the story of us without telling the story of the place. You know, and you're a novelist of place. I mean, they're often socially constructed places and urban places and so forth, but you know you can't understand your characters without understanding where they are, right? And I'm sitting there suddenly saying, you know, it would be like writing about an animal, you know, writing about a tiger or a lion by going to the zoo and seeing them in their cages. We've made a cage for ourselves that, you know, we've talked ourselves into thinking that we're the only game in town. We're the only interesting thing that there is. And that's warped us. And 9 or 10 months after this excursion, thinking, I had a little glimpse of what it would mean to belong to a place, to actually think of myself as part of a situation that was mostly not me. Since I was still thinking of it 10 months later, I thought, that's got to tell me something. I went back and bought a house, and I've been living there ever since, the last 3 years. The book's out. I've been on the road for a year. I don't see myself moving out anytime soon.
You know, I think of you often there, because I do feel like you're having just many more kind of close encounters with...
Bears?
Yeah, there were bears.
She only lives 4 hours away now, and she's promised many times to come, but she doesn't like this 4-foot thing.
I'm an urban person. I live in the city of Atlanta, but like even though when you were explaining the phenomenon of the eclipse out there,
yeah.
I mean, I was in New York City when the eclipse happened, and I was like looking at it through my kitchen colander. You know, I saw like on NPR that you could see the eclipse with your colander. And when he told me about what he saw, I realized that I did not see an eclipse. I saw a kitchen colander. Could you tell them just a little bit about your moment with the eclipse, please?
So it passed over my deck. And where I live, you know, I don't have a lot of property, but it's contiguous with the park, with the largest terrestrial park in the US. 800 square miles of forest in my backyard. So I look out and I see it as if my house goes right into it. And the eeriness of the experience had something to do with the quality of light and something to do with the air, the quality of the air, as urban people would have reported. But it had a lot to do with the quality of the sound and the sense and the anxiety in the woods around me. They didn't know what was happening. And I could hear that. And then, you know, after full, you know, in those first few seconds, there was an eerie silence in the middle of the day. That was, to me, that was being out there where this has happened so many times, you know, and the lifespan of a creature and the lifespan of a tree and the lifespan of this astronomical event intersected in the weirdest way. And I was there in the middle of that moment and hearing the bewilderment, which is a beautiful word if you think about it etymologically, right? The rewilding of this moment. Yeah.
What do you suggest? What with the Overstory, and so many people have read it, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have read it. what we all still, we live our urban lives, we live our you said you were tree blind.
Yeah.
And now you're not. I feel like everyone who's read this book is no longer tree blind.
It's like Amazing Grace, isn't it?
But what next?
I was blind and now I can see.
Yes, we were lost, now we're found, but now what?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And as you know too, I mean, the question is complicated just by the anxiety of following up something that had an attention that the rest of our body of work hasn't had. And I could ask you that same question too. Do you really think that there was something qualitatively different about this one over your previous books? And there is and there isn't. I mean, I knew when I read your galley, but I thought that on the previous galley too. And there's something simply about being in the right place at the right time and things coming together for you. But once they do come together, now the question is, okay, what have you done lately? And how do you follow up on that? And for me, it's complicated because now I'm really committed to this idea that literary fiction, it can't be just a one-off. Oh, you remember 20 years ago that book about trees. I want to see it now as part of something, part of a moment where literary fiction says, yes, the non-humans are any story that we tell about ourselves, they need to be in there, as we knew always, as all myth and legend knew. Right? How do you continue? In a way, I feel like I got lucky. Like I created characters who were quirky or eccentric or vivid enough to seduce the reader who only wants the human deep enough into the book for them to have happen what happened to my humans, which is this realization of, we're not here alone. But how do you do it again without actually repeating that same formula? And I'm at work on it, but it's not trivial.
I have another question. You're saying about this tree blindness, I like the term. In the Overstory, there are so many family sagas and so many people have had familial relationship with trees that have been with families for generations. And in the Overstory, the characters are aware that this was my grandfather's tree, my father's tree. But when I read it, I realized, as I said before, I'm from Atlanta, and Atlanta is a city with a lot of trees. But all my life, there was a hickory tree in my yard.
Was it a mocker nut or a pig nut or? Sorry.
It was very tall. It was really tall, and it had branches and leaves and things. But I knew it was a hickory tree. I knew what kind of tree it was. But it was always there throughout my childhood. And I knew it. And my dad built like a little little round bench around it.
Wow.
And when I read the Overstory, I thought, oh, that bench was kind of the tree that was a gift to my family. Right. Although we don't live in that house anymore. Someone else lives there. I hope the tree is still there. But I was wondering if, as you were writing this, even though you had been up to that point tree blind, did you look back and realize that maybe you had a relationship with trees that you didn't know you had?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And one similar to the one that you describe. I think it's hard to be on this human, to be a human on this earth without having some moment like that. And I wrote that into the story of Adam and his relationship to the maple in his backyard and the trees that were planted for each child and the sort of horrific correspondence that happens between the trees and the kids. So that became fodder for the book as well. But I'll tell you, one of the most satisfying things about the book is the number of people who just, after reading it, want to say, you reminded me of something I haven't thought about for 40 years or 50 years, this thing that was important to me. And, I think when we start out, all of us are naturalists. Every kid is a little scientist, and then we lose it. And in a sense, you can say the same thing about this historical process that we were talking about at large. Humans on this earth, there was a time when it was essential for us to be natural scientists, to understand the rhythms and the limitation. As Thoreau says, in this beautiful phrase, he says, breathe the air, drink the drink, taste the fruit, live in each season as it passes, resign yourself to the influence of the earth. When we were young, we knew that. When we were young as a culture, as a species, we knew that. When we were young as individuals, we knew that. So now the question is, how do we get it back?
We have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask you 2 questions, because I feel that anyone who reads the Overstory, it makes you want to do 2 things. It makes you, one, want to do something to help preserve the planet. So I want to know what you think everyday people can do, but it also makes you want to write a book.
Nice.
So what advice do you have on those 2 issues?
Oh, that's lovely. Well, let me start with the second. I do get that question, as you do, over the course of your career. People of all experience levels and all ages actually want to know. And you could do better than the Joseph Campbell "Follow Your Bliss." I mean, I feel like I really came into something on this one, number 12, because I gave myself entirely to the nerdy delights of complete immersion in a thing that gave me daily joy. And you can build your story around that. And it can still be a sad story and a heart-rending story. But you have to want to live in that world day after day for 5 years, to make it happen.
Do you write every day?
Not anymore. Back in the day, I used to, if I didn't get my 1,000 words, I'm going to forget how to do this. I'm not a real writer, when I go back, it's not going to be there anymore. And now it's like, if I don't get my 4.5 miles in, under those woods. Of course, what's nice about walking is you get about 1.5 miles in, and it's like, I got to go back because I got like 15 things I have to write down. So it's not like that's going away. It just have a different relationship to the compulsion and where it starts and how to make it happen. So that's the advice on writing a book, And I guess you could, even if you were going to write a book much more clearly in that tradition of 100% psychological, or even venturing into the socio-political, love your characters the way you love yourself, And, if you're not going to do it, your audience isn't going to do it. And you're not going to want to work every day, right? That's true. What can we do at this dire moment?
Yes.
And a lot of people read the book and say, I don't know whether to be hopeful or destroyed by this. I mean, you people went out there, and then they went over the line, and they put everything they had, and it went catastrophically wrong. And they paid a big price for it. And then years later, they had to look back and say, was this just a catastrophic wrong turn? And there's some value in not resolving that morally for every reader. But to me, whatever this question of efficacy, I don't think we're going to get out of this what we've done by making small negotiations within the basic sense of individualist, capitalist, human exceptional. Small negotiations aren't going to do it. There has to be a change in the way that we look at everything that's not us. And what I tell my readers is, look, if you're telling me that you're walking down that street in Brooklyn, that you've walked down the last 12 or 14 or 15 years, and you're excitedly reporting to me that there's something halfway down there that's doing an amazing thing that you didn't see for a dozen years, I'm saying the revolution's already started, and there will be a trigger point when sufficient number of people say, it's not just about us, that it won't seem like a sacrifice. It won't
Will it
seem.
happen in time?
Well, that I can't. Time for who? See, here's an interesting question, and that's a good send-off. Here we are, 100, 200,000 years into this experiment, and the future's looking a little dicey, right? Those guys have been around for 400 million years, and they've lived through many mass extinctions. All I can say is, we're not going through the way we are now. If we want to stick around for a long time, we got to make friends with them. We got to figure out what they're doing.
Thank you very much.